If you ask someone to name a battleship from Pearl Harbor, there's a couple obvious answers. Arizona, naturally, probably followed by either Oklahoma or West Virginia, or maybe even California or Nevada if you're feeling adventurous. The others, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Utah, and Maryland, tend to be a bit more overlooked. Today's video will focus on one of those, USS Maryland, one of two Colorado-class battleships moored in Pearl Harbor, with the other being the ill-fated West Virginia. Maryland came out of this far better than her sister. Ultimately, she would survive the war with relatively little damage across the Pacific, but that's for later. First, let's look at where she began. Maryland was laid down on April 24th, 1917, and launched on March 20th, 1920, with the commissioning coming on July 21st, 1921. All told, a fairly average construction period by the Newport News Shipbuilding Company. Although she was commissioned a couple years before Colorado, leading to some sources calling it the Maryland class. Either way, Maryland was a prime example of the final, completed take on the standard type battleship, a design practice that aimed for a unified battle fleet of ships that were more or less capable of steaming together. The same speed, the same turning circles, and the same range. For most of these ships, they also had the same firepower. Colorado, and by extension Maryland and West Virginia, would buck that trend. Instead of 14-inch guns, these ships carried 16-inch or 406 millimeter. Specifically, 8 of those weapons and 4 twin turrets, a super-firing pair on the bow and a similar pair on the stern. That was a large jump in firepower, to say the least, though the rest of the design was more, well, standard. She carried the same 14 5-inch secondary guns as Tennessee, the immediate predecessor, along with 2 submerged torpedo tubes, one on either broadside. Armor protection was also much the same as the other standards. A main belt of 13.5 inches, 340 millimeters at its thickest, with the deck armor coming out to 3.5 inches, 89 millimeters for its part. This is a theme that continued with the speed, which was 21 knots on 28,900 shaft horsepower, the same speed as the other standards. And this is also where the design details come to their end, at least for now. Instead, we can turn to the service history, though this did, as you could expect, start out without much fanfare. As previously noted, USS Maryland joined the fleet on July 21st, 1921, at which point the United States was firmly into its peacetime rotation. While Maryland had the distinction of being the most powerful battleship in the Navy, there wasn't exactly much to do. Her status as the pride of the fleet meant that Maryland was mostly used as a showpiece. For example, at the 1922 Naval Academy graduation, followed by a visit to Boston for the anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill, and after that, taking the Secretary of State to Brazil for a state visit. The ship would also go on a goodwill voyage to Australia and New Zealand in 1925, before 3 years later carting Herbert Hoover on a tour of the Pacific coast of Latin America. The kind of things you expect of a peacetime capital ship, especially in this time period. In any case, Maryland would occupy her time on training duty outside of those voyages, be it the Pacific, the Atlantic, or the Caribbean. The battleship was present for the many interwar fleet problems, as well as smaller, more routine training exercises in between the big affairs, with the odd refit to break up the pattern as well, including the fitting of 8 5-inch anti-aircraft guns at the end of the 1920s. That said, there isn't really much of note during the interwar years. Maryland did her duties well, but she doesn't stick out particularly much, aside from being a very reliable ship. Not like, say, Arizona and her infamous passenger, one Miss Blair. So, with this in mind, let's leave the interwar years behind and move to the 1940s. At the start of this decade, in 1940, Maryland joined the rest of the Pacific Fleet in the move to Pearl Harbor from San Diego. This change in operating base wasn't without controversy, being a much more forward and aggressive base than California. However, it was still done, and Maryland would remain based out of Pearl Harbor into 1941, continuing the routine of training and refit, though by this point, with much more of an eye towards potential conflict with the Japanese. A conflict that the Navy could see coming, but not in the way it ultimately arrived. When December 7th, 1941 rolled around, Maryland floated at her dock as always. Her crew went about their usual Sunday morning routine, completely unaware of what was approaching. They were, as with the rest of the Pacific Fleet, caught completely flat-footed when the first bombs began to fall. Maryland's crew, to their credit, were quick to jump into action. Shortly after the first Japanese attackers struck, the crew went to general quarters, with one man in particular, Leslie Short, opening fire before any other. He's noteworthy here because Short's fire is credited with downing a torpedo bomber peeling away from Oklahoma. Short's fire avenged the attack, but it wouldn't help Oklahoma. The battleship started to shudder from repeat torpedo hits, one after the other, serving as an impromptu and highly unfortunate shield for Maryland. Oklahoma absorbed every torpedo that may have hit her newer cousin and would pay the price. As the old battleship capsized, Maryland's crew continued to engage Japanese attackers, despite their own ship suffering 2 hits of her own. Not torpedoes, but armor-piercing bombs of the same kind that sank Arizona. Fortunately for Maryland, those didn't hit anywhere near where the bomb on Arizona would. The first hit the forecastle, punching a 12-foot by 20-foot hole in the deck, while the second one went off inside the ship, causing severe flooding. Maryland went down about 5 feet, 1.5 meters by the bow. Bad damage, yes, but hardly fatal. You can actually see the lower bow here in a famous picture of Oklahoma's capsized hulk. Through it all, the crew continued to fend off the Japanese, joined in turn by any survivors of Oklahoma that could scramble aboard. Their own ship was beyond saving, but these men, often soaked and covered in oil, helped protect Maryland, and in so doing, protect their crewmates still in the water. In the end, Maryland would only suffer those 2 bomb hits as a result, with some of the lightest losses in crew that day. Just 2 officers and 2 sailors, 4 men in all. A very stark contrast to the many men lost on Oklahoma, despite Maryland's crew attempting to rescue survivors. Regardless, when the attack came to its end, Maryland could be sent off for repair work. Being stuck next to Oklahoma slowed this process a bit, but she would still enter dock by December 30th, specifically in Bremerton, where she joined Tennessee for repair and modernization. Though it should be noted that this work would be nowhere near as extensive as that given to West Virginia. That ship had required the full rebuild due to her far more extensive damage. Maryland, relatively unharmed, was needed in service, so she had a more austere refit, namely in replacing the older 5-inch 25 caliber guns from the 1929 refit with 5-inch 38 caliber weapons, and single mountings 4 to a side. Her fire control equipment was also overhauled while the ship was brought back to service status, with this work coming to an end on February 26, 1942. That said, the need for shakedown cruises kept her off the West Coast into June, and as a result, out of the early phases of the war. Not that she would have had much to do other than escort convoys. One underappreciated part of the early Pacific War was oilers. The Navy had enough fuel tankers to supply one or the other of the carriers and battleships, not both. With the early Pacific War being a decidedly carrier-centric affair, Maryland joined the other standards in staying close to home, even during Midway. Perhaps especially during Midway. Either way, Maryland wouldn't sail out into the Pacific proper until August 1942, and even then she would serve mostly on convoy escort duty, along with patrolling out of Fiji to watch for Japanese moves in that direction. Important, but largely uneventful duty. Something that would last well into 1943. Maryland was either on patrol, refit, or training duty until October of that year, at which point she was sent off to join the invasion of the Gilbert Islands in November 1943. For this, she was the flagship of the Southern Attack Force, which, among other things, also included carrying General Julian Smith of the 2nd Marine Division. That being said, Maryland's role in the invasions was about what you'd expect. She turned her big 16-inch guns ashore on November 20th to spend 5 days bombarding Tarawa. One of many ships doing the same, though the effectiveness wasn't quite what the Navy had hoped for, even though Maryland's gunners wrecked pillboxes and other emplacements, including when Marines called for support against Japanese machine gun nests. Still, the Japanese did suffer from this, and Maryland performed her duty well, even when that duty shifted to protecting transports until the end of the month, with the battleship ultimately detached from duty on December 7th, 1943, arriving home soon after. She would remain there into the new year, only returning to combat duty at the tail end of January 1944, this time to support landings on Kwajalein Atoll. In this, Maryland would fire ashore on January 31st and February 1st, in the process helping to secure what became one of the major American anchorages. By this point, however, the ship's guns were a tad bit worn out, so it was back to Bremerton, this time to replace gun barrels and fit more anti-aircraft weaponry. With this overhaul keeping Maryland close to home for a few months, with the ship returning to the wider Pacific on May 5th, 1944. This time to join up with the invasion force sailing to the Marianas. Once again, Maryland would turn her guns ashore, in this case on Saipan. Starting from June 14th, the battleship pounded Japanese shore positions. She would wreck 2 coast defense guns and then turn to other targets, a process that would continue for several more days, with Maryland's lighter weaponry fending off air attacks. Her first Japanese aircraft was shot down on June 18th during this. Well, first, not counting the ones at Pearl Harbor. Unfortunately, her luck would run out during this process. Maryland was struck by a Japanese torpedo bomber, a G-4M Betty, on June 22nd. Her bow was hit by a single torpedo, which blew a large hole in the starboard side. And I do mean large when you look at it here. It wasn't crippling damage, and Maryland was able to steam under her own power to Eniwetok for safety, and from there to Pearl Harbor for proper repair, even if she did have to go the entire way in reverse to avoid aggravating the damage. Miraculously, the ship continued to keep her crew safe during this. Only 2 men were lost, bringing her total lost crew to only 6 after nearly 3 years of war. On top of this, thanks to prompt work by the dockyard, Maryland was only in port for a little over a month. The ship would return to the war on August 13th to once more, and I'm quoting myself here, hate Japanese-held islands from existence. That is, to provide very necessary gunfire support. This time in the invasion of Peleliu. Maryland first fired ashore on September 12, 1944, with the ship continuing to do the same on the 15th when the proper invasion would kick off. This time she wasn't damaged in turn and would wrap up the operation by the 19th, only to be sent off for yet more bombardment work in October. In this case, the invasion of the Philippines. Maryland would begin this operation by covering the landings on Leyte on October 18th, dodging mines in the process. From the 18th through the 20th, she provided gunfire support, and after that, covered the transports. An important duty, actually, because the Japanese threw everything they had left at Leyte Gulf, with Maryland's role in the Greater Battle of Leyte Gulf coming on October 24th, and into the early hours of October 25th. Maryland would join other American battleships, including Pearl Harbor veterans, in engaging Japan's southern force, specifically the battleship Yamashiro and the cruiser Mogami, alongside their destroyer escort. It's pretty much impossible to know what, if anything, Maryland hit during this, but her shellfire did contribute to the savaging of Yamashiro regardless. That said, once the southern force was wiped out, Maryland returned to her old work, aside from a short stint in dock in early November for resupply. And I mean short. Maryland was back in Leyte soon enough, where she covered the fleet from Japanese attack. Unfortunately, those air attacks would hit Maryland as well. Maryland was struck on November 29th by a kamikaze. This hit between the bow turrets, starting severe fires. 31 of the crew were lost, with a further 30 wounded. The worst loss of life the battleship would suffer during the war. Even so, the actual damage was relatively minor. She remained on station until December 2nd, at which point Maryland set off for repairs that ran into early 1945. By this point, the ship had earned the nickname Fighting Mary for her resilience and constant combat duty, a duty she returned to in March 1945, with the battleship arriving off Okinawa on March 25th. She had missed Iwo Jima due to the kamikaze damage, but more than made up for it here. Maryland would support the troops ashore, including a particularly interesting event on April 3, 1945. Minneapolis, unable to silence particularly tough shore batteries, called on Maryland to do the deed, which she would do. Shortly after this, Maryland temporarily left her support position on April 7th to join other battleships in setting up a blockade should the battleship Yamato break through the air attacks sent her way. As the Japanese ship did not make it through those strikes, Maryland was set to return to Okinawa, only for a second kamikaze to strike her that night. This crashed into the top of the third turret, wiping out the 20mm gun position. 10 men were killed, 37 wounded, and 6 missing after this. Once more, the battleship shrugged off the damage and remained in position, even though her third turret was left unused. On April 14th, the damaged ship was allowed to return home. She arrived at Bremerton on May 7th for another refit. Even though this refit would not be put to use, Maryland only finished it in August when the war came to its end, resulting in her final service being Operation Magic Carpet Runs to bring men home, with the ship removed from service in early 1946 and put into reserve, where she would endure until 1959 before finally being scrapped, thus bringing an end to a long and successful career. Fighting Mary would live up to that name, to say the least. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.